ado, I introduce you to Laurel Watson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to first put out a disclaimer. I haven't talked in front of a crowd in a while, so I'm hoping that this will go well. So my name is Laurel Watson. I'm the curator of the Hayden Heritage Center, and today I'm going to talk to you about gunfights, murder, and mayhem in West Routt County, and hopefully I'll do this correctly. Go to the next slide. Oh, thank you. Having technology issues here. Okay. So I work at the Hayden Museum. I don't know if any of you are familiar. The Hayden Museum is located in the Moffett Depot. It was built in 1918 and we're over in Hayden. Basically what I tell people, since it's such a small town, there's a new come and go, just head north 2 blocks and there we are in a big old brick building. Hayden's not a big town, you can't get lost there. Currently we're open Tuesday through Thursday, 11 to 4, and during the summer we're open 11 to 5 with free admission, and there's a little look at it. And do I listen to myself? Let's see. And so just so you're aware, we have a research library. We are the caretakers of the Mount Harris Memorial, and we have a little gift shop at the museum. So on to the top. I guess I should also tell you some of my work, my primary work. I have a master's degree in American history. I focused on this area, predominantly women and the red light district, which came through with the railroad. So a lot of people probably know me from the Brooklyn. That was a lot of my research was Brooklyn, which is a little neighborhood that's just east of here. But I'm going to talk today about West Routt County. So 1870s, one of my first stories, I don't know why I've got to hit that button, arrow button. The first story I'd like to tell you about is about the Bear River Colony. So a lot of these stories are, there's murder, there's mayhem, a few scandals. Sadly enough, or interestingly enough, a lot of the people who are involved in these had no photographs. So I'm going to try to show you period photos to get you kind of in the feel of what it was like at that time in West Routt County. Hopefully you can all see that. So the picture that you're seeing on the left was what was originally the first part of Hayden. It was the little store that was put up by J.B. Thompson and Porter Smart's son, Albert Smart. The Smarts came in as a venture in 1874. What they were doing was selling preemptions. So you basically, which is basically squatters, which really wasn't, I'm not too sure how legal that was in the first place. But Porter Smart, PM Smart, down there in the corner, he, this time frame, you saw a lot of people that were very entrepreneurial. You know, they saw something, they thought, well, I could probably make some money on this. And so he saw all the land over here. He was making trips, he worked for the government. He worked for the governor of the territory. And he was supposed to go out, and it was an immigration commission. He was supposed to sell the area, the territory to people, to get people into areas where there weren't so many people. And basically what he did was he told people, for $20, I can find you a nice homestead spot. And you can sit on it as a preemption, and eventually you can file on it. Free, you know, basically free land. I mean, the filing fee was about, what, $3 to $5? I mean, it's not bad. Until, of course, they had to make the trek over to where Hayden is. The beauty of it was that he did put out a lot of money. He got a lot of people involved. He made a lot of promises, which didn't always pan out. But when the county was formed, And once we became state in 1876, the county was formed in 1877. They already were kind of established, and they had a number of people over by Hayden. And so when the governor was looking at it and they created the county of Routt, they set Hayden as the county seat until a formal election could be held. So they built another building like these, which was the courthouse, and held court once a year. And they got a sheriff, Joe Morgan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Joe Morgan. The Morgan brothers, there's Morgan Flats, Morgan Bottom, Morgan Waterfall. There was a number of Morgans. Well, Joe Morgan, he figured he wanted to be sheriff. He had a good rapport with the Indians down at the White River Reservation. He had his own trading post. Anybody familiar with Moffat County, where Ike's auto is on Highway 40? It's a junkyard type looking place. That's about where his trading post was. So Joe wanted to be sheriff, so in order to be sheriff back then, you had to set a bond. So he had to find a bondsman. He got a $10,000 bond. The Smart signed his bond because Porter Smart had the money. There wasn't a lot of people in this area. So he carried the bond for him. Sadly, a few months after Joe was made sheriff, his first order of duty came from the Colorado court system. He had to go repossess some equipment that happened to belong to the Smarts. Did not set well. They reneged his bond. So he had to go find another bond. He could not find, nobody would give him a bond because Smart had a lot of ties. So he was one of our shortest lived sheriffs in Routt County. He decided whatever, and he walked away from it. Eventually he went up to Little Snake and he lived up in that area. But I thought that was kind of a funny story. I've been talking with Paul Knowles, and they just got a large collection of Morgan items. If you want to see, I think they're working on an exhibit over there. And so we just thought that was hilarious. Not a lot happened in the 1870s until the Meeker incident took place in the 1879. We don't know a lot of information. I've been doing a lot of research on the Smarts, but when I first started 12 years ago at the museum, there was little to nothing known about the Smarts. So they've been one of my areas of my bunny trails, I call them, because I go down bunny trails. That's why I did the PowerPoint. I didn't want to take you on that journey. It would just be painful. I have attention deficit or something. I don't know. I go all over the place, so I'm just warning you. But so there wasn't a lot that went on. There was a lot of drama with the Native Americans, whether or not there were fires. Some people thought that they were real. Some people thought, well, the Native Americans were just using the fires to herd animals. Eventually, it all culminated with the Meeker incident in 1879. Young man Rankin did a ride, told everyone to run for it. The Smarts and quite a few of the other people who were up there on preemptions, they ran for it, never to return. So we don't know that much about those people. In the 1880s, you started seeing people coming into the area. I don't know why it did. It's telling me I'm taking too long. And so it was pretty much an easy time. People really were coming in, they were setting up their claims, they were working hard, they were trying to find their spots, they were trying to find their land. There wasn't a lot of angst at first because I think there was enough room for people not to really be on top of each other. So we don't have a whole lot of stories of violence at this time. It's not until really the 1890s when people started to really fill in the areas. There was these big cow herding entities that employed cowboys, and they started kind of running amok with the settlers that were coming in. But the town was starting to develop, and it was fairly calm for the 1880s. It wasn't until the 1890s that you started seeing the saloons really come in hardcore over into Hayden. We had, I think, 3 saloons over there, which, if you look at the picture, yeah, it kind of makes you think there wasn't a lot going on. Yes, there were saloons. You could always make money with a saloon. I believe there was also a hotel. And if you look at the picture, it's kind of interesting. The building on the far right is the schoolhouse. It's one of the first schools that were built. They were doing school out at one of the homesteaders, the Reed's house, and they built that school so that they had a school, and they used it as a community center, and they held dances there. Directly across the street, that false front building was the saloon. So you pretty much had the whole town. About to the left of that was a store and restaurant and saloon as well. And then you had a blacksmith, because you had to have a blacksmith. So you had really the basics that you needed in a town in the 1890s. And so it was at this time that they would hold dances quite often. I mean, there wasn't a lot to do. Dances back then consisted of all-night affairs, which is kind of fun. And of course, across the street, you could go run over and grab yourself some beer, grab a drink, a whiskey, or a card game, or a game of dice, faro. And so this is where my next little event. This was really, I hate to say it, well, no, it's probably a good thing to say, but this was really the only actual gunfight, like you would imagine a gunfight, of cowboys over cards, you know, throwing down and shooting at each other. Although it was not as, probably as well organized as you'd see in film, because these guys were drunk. They probably didn't know what they were doing. They shot up the place like crazy. And they didn't even hit each other, except for the one guy did get hit and die, but you know, everybody was getting hit at this point. So it wasn't this cool, you know, gun shooting. It was more like these couple of drunk guys just kind of letting off. John Ogg was a Indian. He was a they called him a half-breed. He came from Texas. They called him Texas John. And he worked for the Temple Ranch. He also sometimes worked for the Carries. And he was known, he wore his hair long in braids, kind of kept people away from him because people were still fearful of the Native Americans. And so he'd walk with his guns. He'd always wear his spurs. And he was a gun twirler. He liked to twirl his guns. The problem was he also liked to drink. And so he was down at the saloon getting drunk when a few of the cowboys came in. There was a young man named Billy McCune and another young man who a lot of people didn't know him at this time, William Sawtelle. And Mr. Sawtelle, later on, we find out more about this gentleman, seemed like an upstanding young man, good. He was a cowboy, you know. He was white. We're gonna put it right there. There was a lot of racism back then. And here was John Ogg, who was generally drunk, kind of a loudmouth, kind of boisterous, and who flaunted that he was part Native American. And so they got into an argument. They had been over at the dance, and then they went over to the saloon. They were gambling. Mr. Sawtelle took quite a bit of John Ogg's money and went over to the dance, and then came back. Well, by this time, Ogg had figured out that something wasn't quite right. He figured he must have gotten gypped, and of course, being in the state of mind that he was, got quite upset, pulled his guns out, and proceeded to tell him to give him back his money that he had cheated. Sawtelle laughed at him and said, "No, you lost that money." all stories seem to start like this, right before the shooting starts. And so the shooting commenced. John Og was not the shot that he liked to tell people. He did shoot one young man, Billy McCune, in the leg, and a couple of others and into the walls. But William Sawtell, who was not as inebriated, managed to shoot him and kill him instantly. That was our big shootout in Hayden. There were a few other little shootings, but mostly they were one-sided. Sadly, when it went to court, they took Mr. Sawtell to court and they said, well, you know, he's a good guy, you know, he's white. He shot that guy out of total self-defense. And they fluffed it off and they said, okay, well, that's fine, you know, he'll move on, he's a cowboy, he'll go work somewhere else. And he did, you know. But about a few months later, he happened to be in Craig and showed his true colors and pulled the same thing. Only this time he made the mistake and shot a young man by the last name of Whitey. And he ran. And of course, this was at Ledford, who was sheriff over in that area, or town marshal. And they found out that he was working for Haley. I don't know if any of you know, but Ism Dart happened to work for Haley, the cattle baron. And so a lot of his reputation came out at that point. And the man took off. He went off to South America, and he killed a few other people, and he eventually died in a gunfight in Nevada. Live by the gun, die by the gun. But that was one of our little shootouts that we had in Hayden. For the most part, there wasn't a lot of drinking and wild shooting in Hayden. It was a pretty quiet family town, but things did happen every so often. And one of the families that was very well known was the Fisk family. They came in, they were one of the first back in, I guess you would call it, the first ins in the 1880s. Mr. Fisk came from New York. He fought in the Civil War. He brought his children and his wife. They settled to the north of where Carpenter's Ranch is currently. Very upstanding man. He had a sawmill. He had a couple other adventure jobs that he ran. But he was pretty much an upstanding individual in the community. He had a couple of sons, Irma, Hiram, a little bit off on the names, but his son Hiram did get into a shootout. We find that a lot of the violence that occurred were over either water, land, or women. That tended to be the mainstay, just because Hayden was a pretty small town. There wasn't a lot of drunkards. Well, Hiram in 1893 ended up killing a man by the name of Turner Williams. Turner Williams happened to work for Hiram, and Turner happened to make some illicit advances to Hiram's wife. This was a major no-no at this time. In fact, there were a number of lawsuits of divorces where people's affections, if a wife changed her affections for another man, there was a number of cases where people were taken to court for alienation of affection. And a lot of these were for big dollars, like $2,500. People would sue for. Well, Hiram's wife was not interested in Mr. Turner. And so the story says, because only Hiram and his wife were present during the shooting, that Mr. Turner came a little bit, but they waited the fact that Hiram was from a good family. But Mr. Turner had come and he had taken a shot at Hiram, and Hiram turned around and shot him 4 times and killed him. And of course, it was He went to town, Hiram took himself to town, turned himself into the law. A lot of people did that after shootings. It was quite amazing that they didn't go and just disappear because there was nothing around. But he went down, turned himself in, told them what happened, and he was deemed justifiable murder. You did not mess with a man's wife or his horse. You could be hung for the horse, but the wife, well, if you got shot, that was okay.
Priorities, man.
Yeah, you had to have your priorities. So we didn't have a lot going on until the 1900s. 1900s, and this is Hayden in the 1900s. As you can see, it's slowly growing. Oh, it doesn't come out as well on there. It's slowly growing. That schoolhouse is that building in the front, the right one, not the tall one. Interestingly, the tall building was a hotel. This is where I go off on my tangents. So that was a hotel that a man bought for his daughter. His daughter married a man who was a railroad man. And the father thought he was worthless. This guy was worthless. And he was right, because the man took off on her. As soon as he could, she had a daughter, and next thing you know, he went out of town for business, never heard from again. And so she was left alone with a young child. Fortunately, her father had seen this, good eyesight there, and he built her this hotel. It was the Oxford Hotel. It was 3 stories. It was quite fancy. If any of you are familiar with Hayden, it's where the Rebecca's Lodge is, going up Hospital Hill. Building looks a little bit different though. The interesting part is a cowboy was staying there. He had rented a room, got drunk, fell asleep with a cigarette in his hand. He died. The place caught on fire, and rather than destroy the building, they just took out that floor. So, which I'm not sure how structurally sound that is, but if you look at the building, they kind of took it apart. They say it's haunted. They have a thrift store in there on Wednesdays if you ever want to go in there. But I keep looking at every time I go by, it's like, how did they take a whole floor out of there? So that was a little interesting story for that building. There's always, all the buildings have stories over there. So this is pretty much Hayden. Right there in the front, you've got the well, in case your well was bad. At this time, a lot of people like to put build their outhouses over creeks, and they wondered why the water went bad. Kept down the smell. We have come so far, haven't we? But it was this time, as more people were coming in, that the county was starting to really have a lot more issues. In fact, to the point where they were holding court at this time up at Hans Peak, which is pretty difficult to get to. They would have court once a year. So they decided to have court twice a year because they were getting too many court cases. It was starting to get crazy because so many people were coming in, and it was difficult. And it was kind of funny because in the newspapers, when I was reading about one of the cases, they were saying how so many people were coming from all over the county, and they would stay for like the entire court time, like 2 weeks. They would camp out. All the hotels up in Hans Peak were full. And this must have been like the TV that people like to watch, all the shows, hey, let's go check up what's going on, around the county and get all the gossip, because they would have an assortment of cases, not only murder cases, but there would be civil cases as well. And some of them were quite astounding that they took these things to court. In one newspaper article, a father went to the court and was filing suit because his young daughter, who was under 18, had a baby. And this was a man from the Elkhead area, and he accused one of the bigger families, the Adair family, that their young son had gotten his daughter in trouble. And this ended up in the front page of the Sentinel newspaper, which had to be mortifying for the daughter in 1908. And so the father was suing for this young man to marry his daughter. And I'm really surprised. It's kind of, in some ways, kind of funny because Mr. Adair had recently left his wife of 25 years for a young school teacher. And so he was turning around saying, whoa, 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 no, 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 my son did not do this. There's other young men, there's at least 4 others that probably got her pregnant. I am really surprised no shooting occurred over this whole incident, but it didn't. But those are the kind of cases that they would see, you know, other than the cattle cases and people hiding their cattle from the cattle inspector because they were like, yeah, that's my cow, you know? Because the cattle inspector would go and check the brands, make sure, is that your cow? But there were a number of cases that would go in front of the district court. Hayden happened to have 2 very violent incidents. One of them was in 1908 as well, and it happened between a couple of property owners. In fact, one of them was very well known, F. Donaldson, and it was over water. And so this was one of the court cases that was just huge and all over the place. One of the neighbors, Tipton, went over to his neighbor, F. Donaldson, talked to him. Donaldson turned around and told him, what are you gonna do, shoot me? And he did. The problem was, the young man who did the shooting, Tipton, had only been in the area for a very short time. He was young, he was a hothead, and he didn't realize when he purchased his land that he did not own any water rights. This is an issue that's gonna come up. Water is going to be the next political issue, I think, in this area. It was back then as well, because if you didn't have water, you could not survive. And a lot of the early people who first came in, that was the first thing that they did, was they got land that had water. And then as other people came in, oh, look at this land, it looks so nice. I don't know if you've ever been up in the Elkhead area or anywhere west of here. In the spring, it's gorgeous, it's green, it's lush. I'm from the East Coast, I'm like, oh, look, there's no trees, you don't have to mow anything down. Come August, it's just, you know, fried because there's no water. All the creeks dry up. How are you going to grow crops, to grow the hay? How are you going to survive? And so water became a major issue. That's why they hand dug 2 large and long ditches, the Shelton Ditch and the Walker Ditch over in Hayden, so that they could have water moved around from the river. Well, Mr. Donaldson, if any of you are from the Hayden area, the western part of Hayden is called the Donaldson addition to Hayden. He was one of the original people who came in. He came in as a cowboy. He took up a homestead and he married one of the early families' daughter, Martha Reed. The Reeds had a homestead over on the Breeze Basin. So he was well entrenched into the neighborhood. He sold his original homestead to be platted for the town. So the western part of Hayden, on any of the land documents, say the Donaldson addition to Hayden. So he was a very well-known man. He was a cattleman. He bought a place over on Morgan Bottom, which is over kind of by the Carpenter Ranch, kind of on the north side. And he made sure he secured his water rights. Tipton lived next to him. He got just drainage rights. Anything that overflowed, you know, kind of, he could use that. Well, he didn't like that. They fought over fences. There was quite a few violence like that. And that's how Mr. Donaldson died. Tipton ended up going to prison for quite a while. They thought that the town was going to hang him, so they had to move him over to Steamboat. And he did get out after about 20 years. They released him so that he could die at his sister's. Another major case, which was rather sad, was a school board shooting. On May 8th, 1914, a group of, I'm really talking about Elkhead, it seems like they were pretty violent up there. A group of families in the north area of Hayden, which is called the Elkhead area, met at a school board meeting. One of the families was the Fultons. The Fultons had come in the early 1900s. There were 4 boys. They took up homesteads, but they took up their homesteads all around this man, old timer, who was kind of a cranky old guy. And he didn't like the idea of these young men moving in around him with all their family and all their children and all their animals. He had lived up there alone for a while. And so he was very disgruntled that they were kind of moved all around him, and they kept fighting over horses, and that his horses were getting impregnated by the Fulton horses, and that they were ruining them even though they were range ponies. I mean, this was before the quarter horses and everything. And they just kept butting heads. And so finally the Fultons, which they might have been causing him a little angst, even his descendants say that maybe they were kind of pushing him, tried to get him to move. So they, along with a bunch of other people, gathered up a bunch of money, gave him $1,000 if he would leave the area. Give you $1,000, just go. He took the money. So they thought it was a done deal. The man is gonna leave. He left, he went to Craig, he got drunk, he gambled what money, and he was back within a few months. And back to his old ways, fighting them. They were taking pot shots at each other. He was just an angry guy. And one day he went to a board meeting. They thought everything was fine. They had tried to get him, I should say. So they did try to get him incarcerated, being insane on a couple occasions. They did take it to court saying, this guy's nutters, you know, and the court was like, well, he's not that crazy, you know. We have a lot of crazy people around here. And so if they had kind of taken that into consideration, perhaps this wouldn't happen, but they were all at a school board meeting. They left the school board meeting. All the men were getting their horses when Mr. Oldham, out of the blue, turned around and pulled a gun and started shooting. And it was on the second gun that he pulled out and started shooting that they were able to tackle him. A young man, Corbin, was able to tackle him and get him restrained. But by that time, Cliff Fulton had been shot, which would prove deadly, and his brother was shot in the leg, Charles Fulton, and another young man was shot through the hand, Lighthizer, Sam Lighthizer. So the pictures I have up here show you, this is the Fulton Homestead, basic homestead, and there's the Fultons right there, and the young lady who is standing there was Mary McDowell, and the only picture I have of Cliff is the shadow right there. If you can see it, I know. Cliff never took a photo, but he was always taking photos, and Mary happened to be a school teacher that he was getting ready to marry. That was their cabin. They had just finished. They were to be married, I think, 6 weeks after the shooting. That was when it was slated, and so of course they didn't get married. But this was taken right before the shooting, these photos, which was rather sad. Mr. Oldham did finally go to prison. They did declare him insane, and they did keep him there for the rest of his life. Cliff lingered until sunset, and then he finally died because they couldn't get a doctor there. Dr. Salant was over in Craig, and they're traveling by horses. Another doctor did get there, but just as he was about to pass. So one of my last pictures, I had to show this. I was going to show the tread, this. Paul Knowles found this photo and sent it to me. And this is kind of off topic of West Routt County, but this is 1909, which is the same period that we're talking about. And that's Brooklyn in the background. And so Brooklyn, which is right over here, was the red light district. Hayden went dry in about 1909. So there was no drinking over there. They got rid of all the violence, pretty much the gambling. There was a lot of violence later on. Mostly there was fence jumping. There was quite a few cases over there of divorces. Divorces were really high in the area. That was about our biggest mayhem over in West Routt County, were the divorces. And so I just had to show this picture because Brooklyn is like one of those people, kind of like Cliff, there's just no photos of it. I think the Tread has about 2 photos of Brooklyn, but so I thought that that was kind of cool that you could see a red light district in the background. It doesn't look as crazy as it was. And those are all the stories. Hayden was fairly calm, other than the fence jumping of the divorces. We did have one gentleman who had 2 families, which I recently found out about. He moved out there. He was a very upstanding man, filed a homestead. It wasn't until several generations later, in fact recently, that family members came out to do genealogy. I do genealogy, and they discovered that they were related.
Wow.
And they thought, the first family thought that the father had died. Come to find out, he came out here and decided, you know what, I'm taking up land, I'm just going to take up a new wife. Yeah, it's a lot easier, you know? And just kind of forgot about the old family, and that happened a lot, sadly enough. And then these guys all found out later on that they were all related, which I thought was kind of interesting. I apologize if I was all over the place. It's been a while since I've gotten to talk in front of people. The beer really helps. And if you do have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. So were the divorces mostly men divorcing the women, the wife, or the wife divorcing the man?
Women divorcing men. Yes. The sad part though is that when a woman divorced a man, the children were not hers. So when she made that decision to leave, she left without anything. She did not have anything, and she would probably go with a family. There was a couple of cases of that where, and then the children just never knew their mothers.
How do you get most of your information? In other words, is a lot of it written, or is it mostly hearsay through generations?
So some of it I find there's this wonderful thing, Colorado Historic Newspapers.org. It's free. There is a link on our museum webpage to it. If you go to our library, there's links to different places. Wyoming also has their newspapers online. And so I got a lot of stuff from the newspapers, reading up on stories. We also have archives, and we have a lot of family stories that have been written. They compiled a lot of genealogy back in the 80s. And so we have those family files. So those stories, a lot of people, the older generation didn't really talk about stuff. But the next generation, I'd say like the people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, kind of were like, yeah, grandma was a hooker, you know, and it was cool, you know, and I was like, okay, you know, whereas, you know, you didn't know anything prior to that, you know, how generations are. But yeah, we have, if you check out that site and read some of the newspaper articles, oh, it's hilarious. They wrote about everything. Like you could learn everything about anybody. Hayden had their own little newspaper, and they had like, it wasn't a gossip column per se, but they would allude to people. So-and-so, we saw a young miss out with so-and-so in a car. wonder what will happen in 9 months. And it was like, did they really just say that, you know? But they also wrote about a lot of other things, you know, like new cars, new clothes, and whatnot. But check that, and we do have our files if you're ever interested.
Can you talk a little bit more about the stealing of the attention, and you were talking about the lawsuits and how women typically were getting charged with stealing the eyes and the attention of men who were married. Can you talk a little bit about that and how some of those cases worked out?
A lot of times, what would happen is women would turn around and they were by themselves quite a bit. I mean, figure a ranch is out in the middle of nowhere. And so either a ranch hand would become enamored with them or a neighbor. And if a husband left his wife for too long, now there was justified where women could divorce a man if he did not provide for them. And they could keep, if the man took off, they could keep their children, their house, their home. But a lot of times people were lonely and they would end up with others. One of the cases, oh boy, I was gonna bring up, but so there was a family, Leon Green, which would be Jerry Green, who was on my board a long time ago. He did write about this. So I think it was his grandmother, ended up falling in love with one of the neighbors. So she ended up wanting a divorce from her husband. Well, her husband, Leon, turned around, filed a lawsuit, and charged both the husband, or his wife, and the next door neighbor, basically, the next rancher over, who she did end up marrying later on, $2,500. And they did have to, I believe he had to pay that money to the gentleman because of the loss of affection. Keep in mind, women were considered property at this time. I even hate saying that, but women were chattel. A man could beat his wife. He could do with his wife as he pleased. I mean, she was his property. So a lot different perspective than we have nowadays. And so if he lost that property, well, somebody's gonna pay the damages. And so that's how they kind of looked at it. And that's how it ended up in courts, which I thought was just kind of silly, but you know, we've grown as a society.
And then $2,500 at that time
Was a lot of money.
I mean, it'd be a lot, like around $100,000 value.
A lot, yeah, that would be, because like $500, which was a saloon license, was equivalent of about $10,000. So you're looking at 10, 20, 30, 40, about $45,000 to $50,000. That's a lot of money. So a lot of times they would go into debt. They would have to, it could destroy somebody, basically, which was, I think, the reasoning behind that. Because would you really want to live next to your ex? You know, I mean, even today. But
You mentioned your museum in Hayden. Could you give us a little more information about it? We have been to visit. We'd like.
yeah, you come on down. We have exhibits on the town. Coke Roberts and Cy Dawson Quarter Horse exhibit. We also have exhibit. We're the caretakers for the Mount Harris Memorial. So we have a Mount Harris exhibit. I've got some clothes. I've got, I have the little handgun. I don't have a lot of guns. It was really more rancher kind of country. And so we're getting ready to open the upstairs up. We have a large saddle collection and we have a kitchen set up. And then we're gonna have our rock and fossil collection, which is kind of an awkward thing, but it was donated to the museum in the early days. So our museum started later, after the trad, more in the 60s, and it was in the basement of the original town hall, and it kind of outgrew it. And eventually we got the depot, which was similar design as the depot here, just a bit smaller. exact replica of the one that's in Craig that's getting demoed, by the way. This year, Dan Davidson came over and asked me if there's anything I wanted out of there, and so I asked for some trim.
Why are they down?
People have been stealing the bricks out of the building. I cannot believe that people do this. There's a whole wall missing, but Union Pacific has tracks on both sides of the building, and they don't want to move it. To move it would cost millions, and so it's a hazard right now. So they're just going to demo it, because if somebody gets hurt in there, I think they're liable. So sadly, it will go. We'll be the last one of our design. But yeah, we are free. Come down. I'll talk your ear off throughout the whole museum. We've got displays everywhere, even in the old men's room. Yeah, I was going to make it my office, but it didn't have electricity, so it didn't work out well. But we have a little gift shop, and we have the research library. So we have a lot of books out of print. You can go through our computer and look at our photos. Our website, we have our photos on our website now. So if you go to www.haydenheritagecenter.org, you can get to our webpage. And then we have links for all the museums, because you got to check out all the museums in this area. We have a unique thing with the museums because we're all different. We're in an old depot, which we've been restoring. Then you've got the Tread, it's got the Victorian building and Doc Utterback's building. And then you've got Hans Peak in the summer is really cool. They've got a little, the Wither Cabin. And then you can go over to Craig. I mean, there's these like loops you can do. And over in Craig, you've got Wyman Museum. I mean, you're museum people, so I mean, you gotta make these loops in the summer. Wyman's got everything large. He's got an elk and whatnot in the cowboy collection over in Craig.
So you spoke on the importance of like acquiring the water rights when you're first settling. I was also wondering in this time period, if when you like acquired a swath of land, if you also acquired the mineral rights, or if that was like a separate purchase.
There were mineral rights at this time. So you could have mineral rights. In fact, that's how some people still have their mineral rights, is because they did allow it for a certain period. In fact, you could still get property relinquishments up into the 20s and the 30s. You were still seeing people come in and get land, which is kind of late. I mean, although, in the 80s, you could still get land up in Alaska. But for this area, so it just depended, because the government, I think, came through and made a whole swathe, didn't they, and took mineral rights from land. I just don't have the year in my head. Yeah. Yeah, if you were fortunate to get the mineral rights, because I always wonder about that. Can somebody really come and drill under my house that I have? It would be pleasant. I don't have much of a yard, so I live up here, so as you know, small yards. Any other questions? Well, I hope to see you guys come down to the museum. Oh,
Did the Meeker Massacre have any impact on Hayden?
I'm sorry?
Did the Meeker Massacre have any impact on Hayden?
Yes, huge. In fact, all the early settlers, and I'm trying to figure out who those people were that came in and filed the preemption in the 1870s. There's no real records because they weren't able to file yet. So I'm looking for ways to figure out who these people were. Lou Smart wrote a letter, a 42-page letter, talking about that last summer and all the incidents that arose with the Utes. And but she didn't mention any of the other settlers. She talks about running. They threw the children and what they could into the wagon and took off for Steamboat, hoping, watching for the Indians, waiting for them to come and kill them, which never happened. And they stopped and gathered up a few people, but she didn't mention any of their names. I keep thinking that there's some kind of records from their company, the Western Improvement Company, that might list who made payments. But Yeah, so all those people pretty much left the area. And then some people returned, like the Reeds had been up farther north. They settled down there. But it emptied out the area for a little period, for about a year and a half. It was fairly empty. I think Thomas Isles stayed. He was over by where Moffat County is. So.
One last quick question. From your perspective with your downtown and the neighborhoods around downtown, do you feel like overall a lot of Hayden has been preserved? Or is there an issue with demolition like there is in the old town here in Steamboat?
You know, Hayden hasn't gotten hit yet. In fact, recently they've been working on the downtown, improving it. Sadly, Hayden has fallen into this. Colorado's just boom and bust, and so there isn't a lot of businesses downtown. There was one building, they just restored the facade. They're talking about implementing a code downtown to try to keep the look of the town. For the most part, it's all original. You have to look for some of it. The school is still there. It's behind Porcupine Designs. And a lot of the original buildings are there, but sadly, there were no building codes. And so any Joe Blow could come in and say, I'm building a house, which is not always, I should not build a house. I'll tell you that right now. I should not hammer anything into that people will have to live in. And so a lot of these buildings, we have one right now that the town purchased, which is in fact the Joe Jones Saloon. It's still standing downtown. It is vacant. The town purchased it, but I don't know if they're gonna have enough money in order to save it because it was built on a rock, just cobbled rock foundation, which didn't hold up well. So, yeah, it hasn't hit us as hard as Steamboat. I think Steamboat, it's just so many people moving in here that you're seeing some loss, but you've got a lot of stuff here to keep that in check with the Steamboat Council and Historic Routt County. But it's kind of nice, those old western towns, aren't they? You know, those little sidewalks and the wonky buildings.
Would you mind explaining a little bit more about preemption and how that relates to the homesteading?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. No, I still don't understand this, but preemption, basically what they were finding is as lands opened up, people just kind of went and took what they wanted. They were like, there's nobody living here, let's just take land. And so it basically was squatters. And because really what they wanted is, you always see those where they throw down the flag and everybody runs for land and they grab, I'm thinking of that Tom Cruise movie, aren't I? Where they grab the flag, the corner where the land has all been platted. So preemption is when people came in, they took the land before it was surveyed. And so this led to a lot of problems too, because if you got land, it wasn't necessarily, so when they come in and survey, they do it north, east, and west, and they make blocks. Well, with a preemption, it's, well, my land is, and they would count it out, and by the river, and you turn, it ends at the rock, you know, and it's like, so there's been a lot of issues about fences, because some of those older claims they had to move them when they started surveying. And so some people's houses were on their neighbors. So they kind of had to, a lot of that got worked out in some ways. I think there's a few issues still up by California Park that are a little bit wonky and disputed. But that basically was preemption. And if you did stay on the land and you built a house on it, you could turn around, file on it, file the patent on it. 5 years later, the improvement, so you could get your land. But there was the case where, you know, when they did survey it, it had to be rectified to the fence lines. I mean, it was an interesting thought. There was an economic crisis in the 1870s. So a lot of people came out west looking for land. It was a gamble if you could make it. If you could find land and make it, you were, you know, it was a goal for people.
How is that different? How is that different from filing a normal homestead claim?
How it was different was that you'd have to go, well, they were early on, so it was still a 5 years, and you had to have people who, you had to have witnesses to prove that you proved on the land. You had to build a building by 14 by 16 feet, and then you had to make improvements to your land, whatever those improvements were, and then you had to go basically prove up. It wasn't much different, and I'm not sure about the legality of it, but a lot of preemptions did turn into regular filings.